I wanted to talk to you today about collisions. Oh, hey, that's the theme. But how in the world is the museum anything like a super collider? And for me, the most difficult thing about this talk was really figuring out what a super collider is, right? Because I'm not a scientist. So I'm going to tell you what I think a super collider is, and then I'm going to relate what I think it is, maybe not what it is, but what I think it is, with what I do. A super collider is a really, really, really big thing. Right? It's really big. And what do we do in that really, really big thing? We shoot beams of particles. I don't shoot them. The scientist shoots beams of particles in a circle, and they go round and around, and some go one way and some go the other way. And at 4 different places in this really, really big tube that sits sometimes 500 feet below ground, they create collisions. And in those spots of collisions, the point isn't just to see a really cool explosion. It's a rendering of an explosion that happened on July 4th. For us Americans, that's interesting, but it happened in Switzerland, so it wasn't that interesting. 2012. In one of those collisions, they discovered what is one of the fundamental building blocks of matter, of life, of the universe. It's invisible. It's one of the very smallest things. It's the Higgs boson particle. And it really struck me that what was fascinating about this was it took this really, really large thing to get us to find something that was so small. It took us years and years and centuries to find. But in that moment of collision, they discovered something. It wasn't the impact that was important. It wasn't the violence that was important. It was the thing that was thrown off by this collision. So we're going to talk today about what happens when art and people collide. And I'm not talking about if you run into something and it breaks in the museum, because that would be really bad. I'm talking, it would be bad for you, it would be bad for the work of art, it would just be bad. So what I'm going to talk about is what happens when we collide with the work of art. And in 1979, on January 1, I had a crazy moment of collision. I walked with my parents and my sister and brother into St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. I had the luxury of doing this. And I walked into this space, there we go. I walked into this space, which you see here in an 18th century painting that's actually not at the Walters, but at the St. Louis Art Museum. And in this place, I had a moment of wonder. It was in this place that I discovered, just by being there, that places could speak, that objects can speak. There is not one surface in this place that isn't adorned with something. This was not for me a moment of religious wonder, because my father was a Presbyterian minister, my mother's an Episcopalian, stopped going to church right about the same time that I walked into St. Peter's. So I'm not Catholic. I'm married to a Catholic, but I'm not Catholic. But it was a moment when I really learned that places and objects talk. They speak to me. And it was at that moment that I decided that I wanted to understand how to make objects talk, how to hear them, how to talk with them, and sometimes how to make them talk for me. So we'll talk a little bit about what we do in the museum to make objects speak. And, this just loves scooting forward. It's accelerating. It's the slide accelerator. So I'm showing you here a slide of the actual schematic of how big the super collider is, right? This is in Cern, Switzerland, near Geneva. And it's the Large Hadron Collider, and I just love saying this, the super proton synchrotron. Makes me feel like I'm in 1970s in that Disney movie. So anyway, it's 17 miles in circumference. And as I say, some of it is 500 feet below ground. So this really, really big thing is of its place. It's in a place, it's of its place, it's defining its place. Any museum is also in and of its place. And the Walters not only is in Baltimore and is of Baltimore. Henry Walters gave the museum to the city of Baltimore in 1931 in a great act of cultural philanthropy. But in that moment, what he also did was he set the place in Baltimore, but he also brought the world to Baltimore. Every visitor who comes to Baltimore and to the Walters Art Museum can experience the world. You don't have to go to Japan to experience Japan. And right now on the 4th floor in one of our spaces, you can experience a collision of the United States and Japan. And not only is this collision a geographical collision right here in Baltimore, but it's also a moment when you can get in a time travel machine. So you're going forward and backward and through time. And in this space, you can see two objects that Henry Walters bought at the World's Fairs. And in 1900, he bought this beautiful iris brooch that's about this big. And it is a wonderful, wonderful, unique work of art that is a showcase of what America could do in that moment. He didn't buy it in America, he was in Paris, where this was like #1 object of what US art and industry could create. This is Tiffany & Co.'s US emblem, if you will, of what art and industry came together and collided and made. It's an iris, which is, of course, the state flower of Tennessee, which I love because I was born there. But also, it is made of blued steel, which was, of course, the US steel industry in 1900 was the major industry in the country. So it's showing off industry, what we can do with our product. And the blued steel sets off in the petals these tiny, beautiful Montana sapphires. At the moment when we were establishing national parks throughout the country, Tiffany decides to set sapphires into blued steel and showcase off what American artists can do to show you what American natural bounty, what American ingenuity, scientific innovation and ingenuity can do. And all of this is shown off in Paris at a World's Fair. And Henry Walters buys this, and then 15 years later, goes and buys the other object that I show you here of a Japanese pagoda. And similarly, this pagoda is a wonder of Japanese artistry and what products the Japanese industry could provide for. And in 1915 in San Francisco, Henry Walters snatches this up, and I encourage you to go look at it because each roof, each little layer is of a different kind, different technique of metalwork. It's an amazing object. So when you go into this room, you're looking at kind of the battle of the industries, the battle of the artistry, and you're thinking about, well, gosh, so I'm in 1900, this is really interesting, what's going on in 1900. But then, if you think about where you are in your moment, that leads you to understand that, oh, hey, we're still thinking about the battle of the industry, the battle of the artistry, in terms of what's going on in Asia and what's going on in the US. How many of you have a Samsung Galaxy? Right? How many of you have an iPhone? Right. So the other way that we're like a super collider is that the super collider depends on this notion of the difference of scale. So it takes this really, really big tube, and I don't know if you can see, but there are actually people who are about this big near this tube. It takes this really big tube for us to discover the thing that's tiny. And we do that too in the museum. We have tiny objects that we put near to bigger objects. But sometimes the relation in scale is between you and the object that you're looking at. And one of my favorite kinds of objects are miniatures. And on the right here, you can see a miniature that's really no bigger than this. And I could give a whole lecture about this miniature because it's probably one of my top 5 objects in the museum. It's on view on the 3rd floor, and I encourage you to go see it. But this miniature wasn't originally supposed to be hanging in a case on a wall. It was supposed to be held in your hand, and you were supposed to look at it like this, just like the woman in the 19th century painting showing us how we were supposed to interact with this object. And you were supposed to be thinking about this tiny little object that you're holding, which is a beautiful, beautiful work of art. Some of the parts of her hair were probably painted with a single hair brush. So again, tiny, tiny. But what does this do? You're looking at it, and you're thinking about the person. And this is one of the most famous women of her day. She's sort of like the, I don't know, the Kim Kardashian of her day. I almost showed that slide of the champagne, but I thought that wasn't a good idea. So you're looking at her, and you are possessing the thing. You're possessing the person. But this becomes a ticket to infinity. This small, intimate gesture, even if you're looking at it in the case, the intimate gesture of you looking at something is like a ticket out the back of your head to everything. How much do you love this woman? How much do you hate this woman? Do you even know this woman? What was she wearing? Oh, last night I saw her. She was wearing a beautiful dress. All of these things, you're just going off into a different world. This is not a 17th century gesture. This is a human gesture. This is a gesture you all have made many, many times today. So you've just connected with something you thought, I don't care about that stupid miniature. I don't know anything about the person. I don't even like it. But actually what you're doing all day long is interacting with art and choosing to go on that train out from the intimate to the infinity. You're taking the particle and you're going on the big journey. And what we're trying to do is to create technologies using that gesture that will take you from the individual object out to places like, gosh, what did the family think about this? What are the family stories? Who is that woman? What kind of food was popular at the time? Who collected these objects? We want to use the technology to enable you to have more access and more learning about all of these things. So it's not a one-way street. It's you bringing your geography, your place, your notion to us, and we're in a conversation with you. So I want to end on something that's a little bit harder. So the museum is like the Super Collider, a place where collision can occur. But it's also a place where collision can occur in a safe environment, right? They aren't exploding things. They're exploding things in a 17-mile circumference tube that's giant. We have really hard things that we have to talk about. And I have 10-year-old twins, they're almost 11, and a boy and a girl, and my son came up to me, he loves to draw, and he said, Mom, you know, I don't really understand why those people were killed, those guys who drew for a living, why they were killed. What was that all about? And I had to take him to the museum because I wanted to talk to him about how art and artists are part of that battlefield that we are in right now. And I took him to see this object, which is a portrait now. It's a portrait of Vespasian, who was an emperor, a Roman emperor. And I mean, the guy looks kind of weird, right? Because his head is really big. Well, his head is really big because it actually wasn't a portrait of Vespasian. It was originally a portrait of Nero, right? And who knows about Nero? Nero was the guy who burned Rome, apparently so he could build a bigger house. And he was playing the violin while he was doing this. So he wasn't a really popular guy, and he ended up being deposed and committing suicide, and that was all there. But when the next guy, Vespasian, he knew that was bad, so he erased all the portraits of Nero. Literally, his crew went around and they erased the statues. And then, because it's kind of expensive to do that, they used the statues again and carved his face on it. So I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, oh, hey, that sort of happened when the Clintons left the White House, and they took the W's off the keyboards. Do you guys remember that? It's kind of modern damnatio memoriae. Anyway, so we talked about violence and art and how power and art are combined. Sometimes it's in the erasing of something that's more powerful. Here's a painting that's not in the Walters Art Museum, but it's in the St. Louis in the Rijksmuseum, sorry. And it shows a Protestant church. And when we're thinking about what's going on in our world today, one of the ways that we can think about it is not just in our moment, but what about the Protestant Reformation? So this is a painting that shows a beautiful, pristine, wonderful, clean, white church that you sit in, and there's nothing that impedes your worship of God, right? The Protestants believed that the only relationship that was important was about the word, the thought, and there were no images involved. And so this clean church looks that way because when the Protestants started to reform, one of the ways that they enacted the power of their religion was by erasing the objects that were in the Catholic churches. This is the result of literal destruction of Catholic imagery, what we now call iconoclasm. So when you go to a museum, if you ever have the luxury, and I hope you do, of going to the Rijksmuseum, look for this painting. But if you go to the Walters, when you go in there and you see a painting like this or an object, think about what it represents. It doesn't just represent what it's showing. It represents maybe the whole history of violence before it. And we, if you think about it, all of a sudden can talk about the battlefields that we're on. We can talk about how we, in this moment, and my relationship with these objects, actually, when we come together, that impact is important. So when you go out and you go to a museum, I am charging you with no longer thinking that going to a museum is an activity that you do that is one just to go look at beautiful, pretty things. These are objects that have lived over time, that are representations of their time, and that sit in our time. And their impact with you should actually help us make an impact out in our world. So I urge you to think about the museum as a place where you can have a collision, where you can talk about with your child, with your friend, with the person you don't know who's standing next to you looking at the thing, about your moment in relationship to that moment, and how the two of you, or the four of you, or the one of you is going to walk out the door and make an impact in your society. Thank you.